It is also Conflict Resolution Month, as I think many of you know, and so we have a bit of information on Conflict Resolution Month as well. I think we're lucky here in Colorado to be able to have a whole month that we focus on conflict resolution and encourage others to know more about it. So we're really privileged within the context of Conflict Resolution Month to be hosting our speaker here this evening, Dr. Joseph Folger. In mediation, as in most professional fields, we've seen our theories and our approaches evolve and improve over time. The field of mediation grew out of interacting streams from labor relations, organizational development, and international mediation. Contributions have been made from community development, from human relations, from organizational studies and legal studies, as well as from more traditional disciplines like social psychology, sociology, and communication. As the theory, research, and practice of mediation has evolved, this evolution has been punctuated by points that we might consider as paradigm shifts, or at least as points when certain recognizable voices have called for new and different ways of thinking and doing things. Professor Folger, together with his work with Baruch Bush, represents one of those voices in his seminal work on the transformative approach to mediation. And we are very fortunate to have him with us today. Joseph Folger is a professor of adult and organizational development at Temple University in Philadelphia. He received a PhD in communication from the University of Wisconsin. He's a past chair of his communication department, as well as a past associate dean for research and graduate studies at the School of Communications and Theater. He conducts research and teaches in the area of conflict management, mediation, group process, and decision making. He also co-founded Temple University's Conflict Education Resource Team, which includes a peer mediation program for Temple University students. He's worked extensively as a third-party intervener in organizational, community, court, and small group disputes. He's co-founder and fellow of the Institute for Conflict Transformation. His work at the Institute included assisting with the design and delivery of the United States Postal Service's redress system, their mediation program, which is one of the largest agency-based mediation programs in the country. This work has also included conducting assessment and benchmarking research for numerous organizations and mediation agencies. As one who does evaluation research and work on conflict resolution processes myself, I appreciate the extensiveness with which transformative mediation has been able to be tracked, evaluated, and continually improved through the consistent field testing that is done in the Postal Service's mediation program. It serves as one of the field's most visible success stories. I actually also, I think, have an article over, maybe it's floating around so you can separate. Let me flip it back. No, it's fine. On the redress system and on, there's actually been some very good research done on the success of implementing transformative mediation into a large organizational context. So for those of you that are interested in looking at that more. Professor, and I should just say, this article is actually published by others. It's published by Lisa Bingham and Tina Dabachi, who were then looking from the outside at evaluating the success of the system. Professor Folger has also published extensively in the areas of communication and conflict, mediation, and third-party intervention processes. His books include the award-winning volumes Working Through Conflict, Strategies for Relationships, Groups, and Organizations, which is now in its 7th edition? The Promise of Mediation. I was looking around because I thought there might be people that even brought that along with them. The Promise of Mediation, which was done with Baruch Bush and is in its 2nd edition, and I know many of you who have studied here have had that as a text. In fact, the Promise of Mediation has been translated into 6 different languages. He's also co-edited with Baruch Bush, Designing Mediation, Approaches to Training and Practice Within the Transformative Framework, And most recently, he co-edited Transformative Mediation, a source book, resources for conflict intervention practitioners and programs. He's also published numerous research articles, as well as the edited volume, New Directions in Mediation with Tricia Jones. He's a past board member for the National Conference on Peacemaking and Conflict Resolution. He's helped to establish several major conflict intervention programs, and he's also a consultant with Communication Research Associates, where he conducts communication skills training, coaching, and conflict intervention. So a very busy man. We're very lucky to have him. Please join me in welcoming Professor Bolger.
Thank you, Denver. It's great to be here in Denver. It's great to be here at DU. I've always heard about the program, but I've never been here before. I'm having a chance to do some work here, as well as in Colorado Springs tomorrow and some training on Friday. So it's a great trip to Denver and a wonderful time of the year. So I expected snow, but I didn't see any. So let me get a sense of who's here a little bit first. How many of you are students either in the program or students in other programs here at DU? Good. How many are in the Conflict Institute program? Great. How many of you are faculty here or somewhere else? Great. How many of you are mediators who just came who are not associated with them? So how many of you have heard something about transformative mediation? You've read about it or studied it in some way? Great, I don't have to say much. How many of you have actually had training in transformative mediation? How many of you were Postal Service mediators? We trained over 3,000 mediators for that program. It's huge. We begged the leader of that program not to start nationally, just do regionally, and she said, we spend it when we have the money. And she was right, because the Postal Service no longer has money. So it was important. So Tamara said to me, Joe, would you talk a little bit about transformative mediation, but more from the perspective of the tough issues, I would say. The hot button issues, the issues that are the most pressing, the most difficult sometimes. And I said, sure, I'd be happy to do that. I think that many cases that come to mediation often are difficult cases. A little bit about myself first, though. I actually started as a practitioner. Although I was studying communication at the University of Wisconsin, the reason I got into this field is I wasn't studying conflict at all when I was working on my master's and PhD. I volunteered at a center called the Center for Conflict Resolution in Madison. This was after the Vietnam War, but some of you are old enough to remember that Madison was a hotbed for anti-war protests. And there was some violence that had occurred in Madison, and this center was set up then. I got there after that. But then the center became a conflict resolution center, and I worked there for 4 years. And I was fascinated by the work. I was really taken aback by the power of conflict intervention work. And therefore, as I finished my degree, I put my focus on mediation and conflict resolution, including research and theory, and just kept going in that direction, including continuing to be a practitioner in various places. So my heart really is as a practitioner. And I think most of the work that I've done is trying to translate theory to practice, not just to develop theory, but to really use theory in a way that's practical and that matters in terms of the work we do on the ground. And as Tamara mentioned, I've worked for years when I met a colleague of mine who's a law professor at Hofstra University, Burry Bush. And so when we met in around 1994, 95, there was a nice synergy because he had the legal perspective, I had the social science perspective, but we were tied together by some underlying concerns about the evolution of the mediation field at that time as the alternative dispute resolution field grew. And we had similar thinking about that. And so we kind of collaborated from that point on, and that's where some of this work came from. So it is really an interesting history of balancing theory and practice. So what I want to do this evening is to talk about 3 things. First of all, a little bit about what are the hot button issues, what does that mean, what are the high conflict, sometimes they're called, issues, and how I would see them. And I think this won't be news to many of you who are in this program, because I know that Tamara and other faculty here are very astute with respect to those kind of issues in both interethnic conflict and national conflict, as well as in mediation programs. But secondly then, I want to talk about how the intent and the design of transformative mediation is really an approach that can respond to these difficult issues, and why it's accommodative to the most difficult conflict issues that I think people have. And then thirdly, I really want to spend a lot of time talking about what are the challenges of people being able to practice from a transformative point of view. Because I think it's very telling about why there are difficulties in handling the hottest issues for many mediators. So I'll be putting my biases forward and happy to discuss those and have those challenged. I'm used to that. But I think part of the reason we worked on the development of this is that we were concerned that mediation wasn't in a place where it could allow parties to really engage each other in a way over whatever the issues are, no matter how intense, no matter how difficult. So first a word about what are the hot button issues. I would say that for most of the most difficult conflicts that come to a mediation program or for conflict intervention, they have something to do with people's identity. That the core identities that people have that matter to them are being questioned, challenged, not being accommodated, or worse, wanting to eliminate the identities of people. That throws a broad net. I think of the book by Pierce and Littlejohn, Moral Conflict, which maybe some of you are familiar with, where they talked about intractable issues. Most of those issues are issues of human identity. There's a way in which, whether it's about social justice issues, or it's about gender, or race, or even things like parenting. So in cases where there are custody issues, for example, where there's many states now that have mandatory custody mediation, which I believe exists in Colorado as well, parenting issues become identity issues very quickly. And so I know many mediators, I have never done divorce mediation, but I know many mediators who can't do it for very long because of the intensity of the conflicts when children are involved. And many times those issues are related to how people see themselves as good parents, and being challenged from someone else about their capabilities is a huge threat to identity. Obviously, racial issues, gender issues are all very much intertwined with identities. And these could be within organizational settings, within communities, within neighborhoods, within public policy disputes. It could be any place along the way. The result is what people usually comment about. The reason it's called high conflict is that those kind of conflicts, when they're in mediation, produce very intense and escalating conflict interaction. So I was asked to talk about this in Norway with high conflict parents, but I think most custody mediation cases are high conflict because of the nature of the identities at stake. But you can see in those kind of interactions that conflict is dehumanizing, alienating, very, very emotional in terms of the engagement of the parties. So when people talk about high conflict, that's what they're talking about. To me, it's what I would expect to have happen in most mediation. People who can talk to each other without those threats don't need mediation typically. They can get to yes, or they can work out agreements with issues that don't need the intervention of a third party, or the support of a third party. So actually, I think what I tend to see is that in most mediations, something is going on with identity and with the kind of issues or moral conflicts that people really clash at a very fundamental level. Not always. There could be some small claims disputes that are just about the money and those things. But many of the toughest conflicts in many settings are about that. So I don't know if you would add to that in terms of your thinking about what the hot button or hot button conflicts are, but I think that I would say that the place to start is to think about the nature of identity and how those get challenged in conflicts. So what was the intent in the design of transformative mediation, and why does it then address high conflict issues? When I think of the transformative model, and I've been talking about it more this way, I think of the fact that the model has tried to preserve two characteristics of mediation that make it both unique and valuable. Meaning mediation is unique, and the uniqueness of it is preserved, and valuable for the parties as a process. Those two characteristics are the following. The first is the commitment in the transformative model to the self-determination of the parties. In this model, the idea of empowerment, decision-making of the parties, the choices they want to make, is sacrosanct in the model. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But the idea is that if we're going to have a process that is different from other valuable processes of conflict intervention, not degrading those at all, if mediation is going to be different than arbitration, than the courts, what it's supposed to be an alternative to, then it has to preserve the self-determination of the parties. People who take the training in transformative mediation are sometimes shocked at the extent to which we preserve that characteristic of mediation and have difficulties with it. But the idea is that self-determination comes not just about the content of the dispute, but also about the process, because process and content are intertwined from a communication point of view. Sarah Cobb and other researchers have put that out and clarified that difference. One example, of course, is if we make a decision who gets to speak first when people start telling their stories, if you're using a model that thinks of conflict as storytelling, then the person who speaks first often defines the conflict, and the other person has to break through that definition of the conflict that the first speaker created. So if you or I, as a mediator, make that decision, we are affecting the content of the conflict because the process and the content are intertwined. So one of the things that you see in transformative mediation is the emphasis on the parties' decision-making and autonomy and self-determination about the process as well as the content. That's key to one of the characteristics that make transformative mediation different, but also really makes it different from other types of conflict intervention. So the self-determination of the parties is held to a high standard as the basis for the model. The second characteristic that I think also is the second half of the commitment of the transformative mediation process is that there's a belief in the humanizing power of dialogue. That when people can talk with each other, there's an interaction that occurs which makes possible, doesn't always happen, the fact that people can be more humanized to each other, that they see the person, they see their frailties, they see their emotional experiences, they can see themselves in the other person. And so the idea that mediation offers a chance for human interaction between people, dialogue, that they might not have had before, not had in the same way, is core as a second principle in the transformative model. So we would not, for example, encourage a shuttle diplomacy caucus after the opening stories are told, because that immediately separates the parties, and the interaction that goes on is between the mediator and the parties rather than between each other. Is there ever a chance for a separate meeting? Of course. Different purpose many times than shuttle diplomacy in the transformative model. But the idea that it's about the potential humanizing power of dialogue, that's what you don't get in other types of conflict intervention work that are valuable and different. You know, when you go to court, you barely get to talk. In arbitration, you present your case to someone who's going to make a decision about what's fair, what's right, what should happen. It's not about the dialogue. So to me, when mediation is supposed to be an alternative dispute resolution process, it's got to have those two characteristics. It's got to have self-determination as a key foundational principle in the practice and in the theory. And it's got to have the trust and the belief in the importance of the potential humanizing effects of dialogue for people. No matter what model of mediation exists, I would be happy with it if I saw that the model kept those two characteristics. I think the transformative model tries to do it. If there are other models, I would support them. If they don't support those, I have questions about it, not because it might not be useful, but because it loses something. It loses the capacity that mediation has, which other types of conflict intervention processes do not have. So one of the things that mediation can do is to help people realize that they can build their own capacity to deal with conflict. And they feel that they have a greater capacity to deal with conflict as a result of going through mediation. That's a huge function of mediation. That is something that doesn't happen in other types of conflict intervention work. But when it happens in transformative mediation or any type of mediation which preserves those principles, we are doing something that is highly valuable for the case, but beyond the case as well. And so I'm not someone who's comfortable saying if we mediate 1,000 cases this year and we settle 95% of them, we've done our best work. Because the question is, what are we giving the parties that's different from other models of conflict intervention which could have also gotten to 95% settlements through a court process, or an arbitration process, or something else. So I'm looking for the capacity building dimension which comes from those two characteristics. So to me, they distinguish it and they also define what makes it valuable. So how do these characteristics support the idea of parties being able to discuss and address what we're talking about here is the hot button issues, the difficult issues. Well, what those characteristics do, very simply, and but importantly, is they let the parties bring up those issues, number one. So the idea that parties can talk about whatever matters to them with respect to the dispute, including the issues of identity, and including the issues of trust, including the issues of human connection between them, is important for those issues to even be discussed. So some of you I know, I think you told me, Taryn, that you've shown the Purple House, which is one of the first mediation videos. How many of you saw the Purple House? A couple people. What was one of the first videos we did of Transformative Mediation? It wasn't a perfect, illustration of it. We were still developing the model in some ways. But in that mediation, it was a mediation between a woman, her daughter, and another woman over a condominium home, which the African-American family who bought that home painted it purple. And the head of the condominium association claimed that the purple was not allowable as a color for the condominium. And there was a contract dispute around what could be painted what color. But if you watch that video, what happens is the color purple of the house becomes a metaphor between the parties of race, racism, and the color of the human beings involved in that conflict. And they end up going there because they talk about the structural racism that's based in the committee that sets up these, the lack of consistent enforcement of policies with different people, and basically, blatantly and very publicly in the mediation with each other, accuse each other of racism and defend each other for not being racist, defend themselves for not being racist. And they go there in that process. That's the first video I have ever seen in the field of mediation where that type of issue is ever shown in a demonstration video. You can see other videos where the parties were told, we can't really deal with that issue in mediation. It's not relevant. And I would really like to see somebody redo that video using a different model of mediation. Because I could imagine it being done all about the contract and the dispute and subtly moving it towards a negotiation on what could happen. When in fact, what they wanted to talk about was the issues that produced the situation they were in and the differences they have about their understanding of what is racism and how did it play into this case. That requires the commitment I was talking about, first of all, to self-determination, because the mediator does not get in the way of supporting with their normal intervention methods that topic as a topic in the intervention itself. In other words, it's not pushed aside, either subtly or explicitly. Many mediators used to say, you can't mediate racism, you can't mediate issues like that. And they were subtly, selectively facilitated. Some research by some early people studying conflict resolution and mediation noticed that there was a tendency for mediators to selectively facilitate topics off the table. They just wouldn't summarize them, they wouldn't bring them up. Many of those issues were issues related to these kind of hot button issues because mediators felt that they could not be supported. When you take the commitment to self-determination and you're committed to the potential humanizing effect of dialogue, you're supporting people if they want to go there to hear each other out about the dehumanization effects of behavior on each other. They're able to respond to those kind of charges. They're able to defend themselves and decide how they want to react when they're charged with those things. They're able to determine how they are reacting to each other based upon their own human